Welcome everybody, it's lovely to see you all. We're here to discuss creating global ceremonies. And I'm going to start by handing over to our Pro Vice-Chancellor for Education, Sharon Hutley. Sharon.
Good evening everybody, and thank you very much for coming to join us here tonight. On behalf of Lancaster University, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. 2014 marks the 50th anniversary of Lancaster University, and we are celebrating this in various ways throughout the year, including organising lectures across the country to showcase the university's achievements. We are delighted to have organised tonight's event around Clare Amsel, a Lancaster University graduate in religious studies. Clare's degree gave her the platform from which to become one of the world's most successful producers of major ceremonial events. Clare is joined by the Very Revd John Hall, Dean of Westminster Abbey, and chairing this evening's discussion is Linda Woodhead, Professor in the department where Clare studied and an expert on contemporary religion and rituals. Linda, thank you.
So what we're going to do this evening is talk about how you create enormous ceremonies and rituals, and I have the two best people to discuss that with me. Clare has been producer on the opening and closing ceremonies for the Athens Olympics, for the London Olympics, for the Paralympics, and very recently for the Glasgow Commonwealth Games. She's been sleeping a lot since then, haven't you, Clare? Just recovered enough to come down and talk to us. And John is Dean of Westminster, just across the road. And he is responsible, as we said on the publicity, for the royal wedding, but he does work in between royal weddings as well. And he is in some ways responsible for the kind of ceremonial civic life of the nation. He is repeatedly doing these large ceremonies. He was just telling me he's got the Battle of Britain celebration coming up this weekend, is that right? So two people who are extremely experienced in staging the ceremony and ritual, and on a grand scale, not just national, but also where there's a global audience. So we thought it'd be fascinating to get them here so that they can tell us about what's involved, the practicalities, but also reflect on what ceremonial and what ritual is, and be asking them lots of questions.
I want to start with a quote from Gurdjieff, who said, "A ceremony is a book in which a great deal is written. Anyone who understands can read it. One rite often contains more than 100 books." Well, the definition which I'd used is a little bit less poetic, but I think it's important to define what ceremonies are. So I'd say it's a gathering of human beings, generally lasting from a few hours to a few days, and designed to celebrate, honour, sell, teach about or observe human endeavours. And ceremonies are often repeated and done according to a prescribed order, which makes them rituals. And from the distant to the recent past, I think it's fair to say that the primary reasons for holding ceremonies can be broken down into 5 categories: political, social, educational, and commercial. Now, my focus tonight is secular commercial ceremonies or massive global public events, as those held, as Linda explained, to open and close the Commonwealth Games or the Olympic Games. Now, looking at the Olympic Games, historically speaking, the modern Olympic Games were adapted from the ideology of the ancient Games, which originally treated sporting competitions as a form of religious ritual. And as a result of the Olympic movement in 1906, the Olympic Games opening and closing ceremonies were initiated. Now, this movement transformed the Olympic ritual in the modern era, and for some years now, the opening and closing ceremonies have become one of the most important aspects of the Games, continuing to be imbued with elaborate ceremonial aspects and having grown into 2 or 3 hour long artistic performances watched simultaneously by hundreds of millions of television viewers around the world. In fact, I mean, you could almost say that Olympic ceremonies are unequivocal because there are no public rituals which compete on this scale. Now, there's a school of thought propounded by historians Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger, who'd say that the modern Olympics are an example of what they call invented traditions, ritualized official or quasi-official events, often presented as revivals of ancient practices or in other ways designed to imply continuity with a distant past. And in fact, the late 19th century was a particularly inventive time for tradition making, and that's when many national holidays were created. The practice of commemorating the 50th and 100th anniversaries of notable persons and events also dates from the 19th century. The celebrations throughout the empire of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, the 50th year of her reign, was so successful that it inspired similar anniversary celebrations in other monarchies and led the British to celebrate in 1897 her Diamond Jubilee. Now, I think modern societies are still obsessed with these secular rituals, in part because almost all of them have become successfully commercialized. And maybe they offer an illusion of permanence and continuity in a world that's characterized by mobility, change, and uncertainty. There are many reasons why cities and nations compete so vigorously to host the Olympic Games, but I would say at the top of the list it's to gain prestige and favourable world opinion. And without a question, an Olympic host steps dramatically and alone onto a world stage. Now, ceremonies, as I've mentioned already, have massive global reach and can now be received in virtually every country on Earth, making the planet one family and the Olympics a communal global ritual. So what do we as producers worry about? Well, there's a number of things. Is the script universal enough? Does it show the character of the city and country? And is it innovative? And these are basic questions for every massive public ceremony, because being a global ceremony and ritual watched not only by an international audience in the stadium where it's performed, but also covered by live television throughout the world, one of the fundamental preoccupations of every organizer is to construct a narrative which, whilst being a local story, can be universally understood. So how do you put a ceremony together? Key to the team are the artistic director, whose role is to conceive and create the artistic content of the ceremony, and the producer and the team whose role is to deliver the artistic vision. I've been very lucky and I've produced 3 ceremonies up till now, all completely unique in their own way. Now, most recently, in fact, I only finished a couple of weeks ago, I produced the Glasgow Commonwealth Games opening closing ceremonies. Now, what Glasgow did was very Scottish. It took powerful symbols that had global, not just local resonance, and it wove them into a ceremonial form with its emotional up and down rhythms and harnessed that motivational power to do something extraordinary. It created, with UNICEF, a pioneering massive opportunity to improve the lives of children on the planet. And to date, £5 million has been raised. And in conclusion, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that this has markedly changed the usual focus of opening ceremonies from being one massive party without a purpose to one that could change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
Very much.
Ceremonies at the Abbey are on a completely different scale, and from these enormous ceremonies that Claire has been talking about. But it's a privilege to talk for a few minutes about some of the things that we do at Westminster Abbey. And of course, they're not always going to be innovative in the way that the ceremonies that Claire has been talking about seek to be, and they have a certain degree of continuity about them. Of course, most religions have ceremonies. It is a fundamental part of being religious. I suppose there are exceptions to that, Quakers, but even sitting in silence is itself a ceremony. Ceremonies in religion are an important aspect, a fundamental aspect of the way we conduct ourselves. Of course, what we're seeking to do in our ceremonies is to invoke the presence of God, to recognize the presence of God with us, and to move those who are attending the ceremony towards God into a more intimate and personal relationship with God. And that is fundamental. And I think a degree of continuity is valuable in that, a degree of familiarity. Certainly as an Anglican, the tradition of liturgical worship that has familiarity to it, that has continuity to it, is very important. At 5 o'clock this evening, a choral evensong in Westminster Abbey was as it was last week on this day and last year on this day, and going right back to the time when Cranmer rewrote the prayer book, and evoking something of the character of Vespers and Compline in the days of the monastic community from 960 through until its final dissolution in 1560. But there are many particular ceremonies beyond the daily worship, and there are a very great variety of them. Many of them derive from the 20th century, in fact. On Sunday, Linda mentioned, we shall be commemorating, as we do every year, and have done every year since the Second World War, the Battle of Britain. And we have still veterans who took part in the Battle of Britain. And at the heart of that ceremony is the conveying of a book containing the names of all those who died in the battle from the west end of the Abbey, up past the grave of the unknown warrior, through the choir screen, up towards the high altar. It's received at the high altar and offered at the high altar. And a ceremony, a simple ceremony within a religious service like that, it enables people, I hope, to get the sense of the offering of our whole lives to God and God's blessing on our lives. Offering something at the high altar is a symbol of a moment of encounter between God and those who are being remembered. We have an annual service for Remembrance Day. We have all kinds of annual services. We hope to encourage people, to change people in some way, whether they're present or watching, to encourage them and to help them to reflect and to become, in some way, better people. Thank you very much.
One of the things I was picking up listening to both of you is that what's very clear from what you're saying, John, and it's fascinating because you actually devise some of these things.
Yeah.
You're thinking...
I have a fabulous team, I should say that.
Yes, but you're director and producer in a way, aren't you? Whereas you're producing and there's a director who has the ideas and you make them happen.
Director, that's right. Yeah.
But do you interject and say, oh no, I don't like that, or that won't work, or
yes,
or why not think of this?
No, absolutely.
So you have a creative input as well as...
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean, one has a creative input because you know how the output may be, so you need to kind of give your opinion on how it's going to look. And the kind of teams that we work in, I mean, probably similar to yours, John. I mean, everyone has a voice. So, yes.
Is that how you do it as well?
Yes.
Who proposes the idea?
Someone approaches us, says, would you have a service for this particular event? I'll tell you that we're having a service for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, a sort of harvest Thanksgiving next week, at which I have to preach. And I thought very hard about this, but I thought, okay, let's avoid the issue about the level of tax, and let's think about the expenditure of taxation and the miracle of getting it in, and so on. We've had our own disputes with HMRC, so it makes it slightly sort of edgy. But so we're doing that. But so you sit around the table. We have round the table our event management team, our minor canons team, our communications team, and our music team, with the people proposing the service. And we have a very clear agenda. We have an hour's meeting. It'll be no more than an hour. And we go through the agenda, and that settles the thing to the start. And then there's a lot of interaction between the protocol department and the minor canons department with the people proposing the service. And I do my input and so on. And that we end up with a service.
So Revenue and Custom are going to get what? What's the idea at the heart of the Revenue and Custom one?
The idea is that taxation is good because the benefits arising from it are seen to be good. Questions about level of tax and so on are being avoided.
And how do you show that in a ritual?
The charter of the HMRC is going to be brought up. It's going to be brought up and laid on the altar, and that's the symbol. So you evoke something of what the organisation's about.
But I love this thing that you think of the idea and then you have a symbol, that, whether it's the medals or the charter or the whatever. Now, you mentioned symbols, Claire, and how they have to be... they have to have, well, for you as well, they have to have some global resonance, some of them, do they?
They do.
Or, and how do they get selected?
Well, I mean, there are different ways of selecting it. I mean, there are symbols, national symbols, which are instantly recognisable. I mean, looking at the recent, if we look at I mean, from London, I would say that the NHS was possibly one of the symbols that wasn't instantly recognisable, because a lot of people didn't understand why there were a lot of beds out there, and, a lot of kids and nurses jumping up and down.
So, obviously, nation building is absolutely crucial then in the origins of these big ceremonials, isn't it? And that's the invented tradition.
Yes.
And all those sports are institutionalised at the same time because they were national competitions, and the Olympics is part of that same nation building era. And as we move out of a nation-focused era into a more globally connected one, you're really marking that shift, aren't you, I think, in the way that some of those ceremonies are changing. Yeah. And you mentioned about the UNICEF and the child being a new departure as well.
Yes, I mean, that really was to sort of take two things, or two or three things. It was taking the spirit of Glasgow, which is an incredibly generous city, and also, making this into, it was harnessing the power of, the impetus that you get in an environment like that, where everyone is, hugely enthusiastic for what's going to happen, whether it's the ceremony or whether it's the sports to come. And it's really quite phenomenal, actually, how it's like taking an enormous sort of amount of energy and just channeling it into something that releases global momentum.
One of the most moving events, certainly not televised, and apart from the couple of thousand people there, not known much beyond, was when we marked the 70th anniversary of Kristallnacht last year. And we collaborated with West London Synagogue and St John's Wood Synagogue. And we had people who remembered the events, and other people speaking about it, and Rabbi Julia Norberger gave the address. And there's something with the Shoah candelabra alight in Westminster Abbey, something extraordinarily powerful and important. And what we see ourselves as being, representing, is faith at the heart of the nation.
All faith.
Faith at the heart of the nation. So our ceremony is not intended to be, in any sense, superficial. It's not just about nation building. It's about doing much more than that. It's about enabling people to grow as human beings in love and charity together, and building community. Anything that builds community, we want to honour and respect. And the things that diminish humanity and the pain of that, we want to commemorate.
Very brief word, Claire, then we'll throw it open, but just in response to that, do you have a similar kind of mission statement for what Olympic Games or Commonwealth Games are trying to do? Are they consciously trying to, bring the world together in one humanity, or is it not as clear in the case of them?
I think yes, that in the spirit of what the games are actually about, which is the sport, the competition, and the dignity and the humanity and yes, I think that's true, but I don't think it's exactly the same, because every country takes the ceremony and the story of the ceremony and the narrative of the ceremony, and they're showing the rest of the world what their narrative is, what their history is, and so it isn't always it's not.
But it is a celebration of humanity.
It's a celebration of humanity. Yeah. Absolutely, and diversity.
Yes.
The same in that respect. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, over to you. Who would like to ask some questions?
It does strike me as an interesting paradox. Secular ceremonies of ever greater grandeur seem to be ever more interested in evoking what I would call a religious sentiment, some sort of experience of the numinous. And you really see this with the symbols that are rather pagan, perhaps, of fire worship going on in the Olympics or whatever, with great effect. That's in one direction. The church, on the other hand, grapples with some complexity in seeking to articulate and explain and give meaning for others to services which are inherently Christian. How does it engage with secular and other faiths?
This profession of creating ceremonies, it actually has another name in a sort of smaller form, which is experiential, marketing. So it's all about, as you say, it's about, creating an experience that people desperately want to buy into. For me, the experience of going into an Apple Mac store makes me want desperately to to buy it, because of the way that they just treat you and make you feel and evoke, the sort of magic and the passion and the hallowed sort of sacred nature of it is all about the experience, and so it's really interesting, your point.
But what I think is quite important is rituals need to be well done. And they need to be forward-looking, not backward-looking. That's why I was so pleased you mentioned UNICEF and going forward rather than celebrating, the dead body of Richard III. And I do think that rituals don't need to be dogmatic, they don't need to be doctrinal. They do need to bring in this humanitarian, forward-looking area, which is sometimes neglected.
I mean, ritual in itself is not something that happened, that was created now, or that is of the now. It is something that has been, repeated through history. So I think you have to take it and then move forward, and you can adapt it, and it can change in its form and type of celebration. But there's always it's got a historical root, I think.
I think we are our history. Our history has made us who we are, and therefore we have to evoke our history. For me, the history of the Abbey from 960 is living history, and it's absolutely relevant still today. So that would be my answer. Of course, what we're hoping to do is to lead forward, to change, to build better community, to contribute to people's well-being, both now and in the future. And we're all looking forward as Christians, certainly, to the ultimate, to the telos, to the culmination of everything, to the building of the kingdom, and we're seeking to contribute towards that.
The coronation of King Charles III. He's already said, Prince Charles has said that he hopes to reign as defender of faith rather than the faith. And I think it's almost inconceivable that the coronation won't be multi-faith.
The coronation of the monarch is something that's gone on in the Abbey since the 6th of January 1066, when Harold was crowned, and Christmas Day 1066, when William the Conqueror was crowned. And the pattern for the coronation of monarchs was set by St Dunstan, who was Bishop of London until 960, when he became Archbishop of Canterbury, with the coronation of King Edgar of Wessex. And that's more or less the sort of pattern that's been followed. But I can absolutely honestly assure you that there is no one doing serious thinking about that at the moment.
Okay.
Just to say this, that the Latin for defender of the faith or of faith has no definite article.
It doesn't.
So the question is, how do you stop doing something? Would you like to reflect, and it's the last question, so it's quite helpful. Would you like to reflect on how you actually get rid of ceremonies that you don't want to do anymore? How you avoid this enormous accretion of different ceremonies? It's now the case that you can't have an Olympics without an enormous ceremony of this kind. And is there a point at which we're going to have to start ratcheting down, and how are we going to do that?
I think it's very unlikely that these ceremonies will end. I mean, partly because the industry is only 35 years old, so it's hardly going to sort of kill itself at a half century. But I think that Possibly what will happen is exactly what happened with Glasgow, which is that instead of the ceremony just being there as you know, a sort of celebration, a huge technological celebration, that some of it will be put to greater good. I think that's, you know, the evolution of ceremonies and how, you know, how they're used and to what purpose and, you know, for what good is possibly the direction. I mean,
So it just remains to do the ritual ending and to thank both our speakers for absolutely wonderful conversation. Can you join with me in thanking them very much for giving their time and entertaining us?